I'm Tim Ventura, and we're joined today by Carmen Medina, former CIA Deputy Director of Intelligence and a retired senior federal executive with 32 years of experience in the intelligence community. Carmen is a recognized national and international expert on intelligence analysis, strategic thinking, diversity of thought, and innovation and intrapreneurs in the public sector. She's the co-author of the book Rebels at Work, a handbook for leading change from within. Carmen has spoken to Fortune 500 companies, major nonprofits, and governments on critical thinking, diversity of thought, and intrapreneurship. She's spoken at major conference events on precognition and intelligence analysis, surviving as a change agent, avoiding the mediocrity trap, and on critical thinking. Carmen is a recipient of the Distinguished Career Intelligence Medal, a founding member of the Amazing Women in the Intelligence Community, and serves on the boards of the National Intelligence University and the National Security Institute. She joins us today to talk about intelligence, intuition, and precognition. So Carmen, welcome. Thank you so much for joining me today. I want to jump right in with your book. What are Rebels at Work when you work for the CIA? Can you tell me a little bit about the book and what inspired you to write that?
So I retired from CIA in 2010. And the whole time I was at CIA, I spent a lot of time trying to push new ideas into what is essentially a knowledge organization. And if you've been a knowledge organization the last 50 years, the one thing that you've had to figure out how to adjust to is digital technology and the internet. And it was very difficult for me to be an advocate for the CIA adjusting to digital technologies, because if you think about it, digital technologies are sort of heretical to everything that the CIA stands for. So digital technologies, particularly the dawn of the internet, was about sharing information and open and transparency, and that no one would ascribe those values to the CIA. Although perhaps people might be surprised at how much the CIA tries to move in the direction of those values. So I got a chance to talk in 2010 at an event. One of the first things I talked about publicly since retiring, and I talked about my career as a heretic at CIA. And after my talk, my soon-to-be co-author, Lois Kelly, came up to me and she said, "Why is it that nobody helps people like you? Why is it that nobody helps the rebels at work?" That's her phrase, not mine. And we decided that we were going to be the ones who were going to help rebels at work. So we began a website, wrote a book, and now are sort of peripatetic facilitators of a community around the idea of being a rebel at work.
Okay. Well, and actually I was going to ask about Lois Kelly next, because she brought the private sector marketing know-how to this, and then you brought the government experience to it when you guys wrote this book together. So I wanted to ask, what did you guys learn from each other's diverse experience during the collaborative writing process?
Wow, I think we learned a lot. So Lois, although she had this broad marketing experience, had never really worked in a large bureaucratic organization, at least hadn't worked 30 years in a large bureaucratic organization. And so there were, we both brought very interesting perspectives. I think hers more is how to be an independent and strong, creative professional, even though sometimes you're having to battle uphill with your ideas. And my perspective is, golly, how do you make anything happen in a large organization? One of the big things I will say is a big difference between large organizations like the government and private industry. For the most part, when you're a manager in government, you have to make it work with the talent you have. Famously, it's not easy to fire people from government, particularly for a highly classified job. We spend hundreds of thousands of dollars onboarding a person, getting them a security clearance, for example. So you can't say, oh, well, you don't cut it after 3 months and have them walk out the door. So as managers in large government organizations, I think you have to do a lot more coaching and developing of people. I may be wrong, I'm happy to be corrected always, than in private industry where certainly, I know from experience, large consulting organizations are quite happy to have a lot of turnover every year. That's almost sort of the way they operate.
Okay. Yeah. So the book itself, this is billed as ways, it contains ways to navigate corporate politics, frame and communicate ideas, deal with controversy, avoid common mistakes, as well as managing yourself so that you know when and how to keep pushing and when to quit. So again, this comes out of both yours and Lois' experience, but can you share some examples of those things? What are some of the things that you're helping people, do, I guess, as rebels at work?
Great question. And a lot of these, the book was written some time ago, and we have continued to learn. In fact, I will say that when we first came up with the idea in the manuscript for Rebels at Work, a lot of people thought we were nuts. Why would any business person or manager want a book that shows their employees how to be rebels, right? But since we wrote the book, there's been a lot more people talking about the ideas that are in the book. And of course, now with whatever's going on in the workforce, whether it's the Great Resignation or whatever you want to call it, this idea of individuals being more powerful at work and looking for jobs where they can be their authentic selves has become much more important. So let me give you an example, a very practical piece of advice we give people. And I'm not sure this is in the book because this is something that I've definitely learned in the last few years. One of the questions that rebels need to ask themselves, no matter what environment they're in, is how many of their great ideas can their organization tolerate? Okay, you're an idea person, you're creative, you've got a lot of input. Is it wise to present all those ideas at one time? Or even, present many of them over a short period of time? Probably not. You're probably burning yourself out a little bit, and certainly testing the limits of the toleration of your organization. So as you embark on your journey to be a change agent in an organization, you need to ask yourself, how many of my brilliant ideas can the organization tolerate? Is it one idea a year? Is it 2 ideas a year? I'll guarantee you it's not all of them. And then once you ask yourself that question, then you go, well, I have to have a strategy for choosing among those ideas. And there's lots of different ones. There's no ideal answer for everyone, but you might try to prioritize ideas that you think are more consistent with the corporate philosophy. Or you might try to prioritize an idea that you think your immediate boss would actually groove on, right? Or you might prioritize an idea that would not require any additional expense on the part of the company. There's any number of things ways you could prioritize. But the key thing is to be strategic about presenting your ideas and be aware that your organization is never going to be able to tolerate all of your great ideas. That's just a fact of life. So proceed accordingly.
Yeah. Well, so the book Rebels at Work, this was published in late 2014. And as you've mentioned, a lot has changed since this came out. Have you guys been tempted to undertake another book, like maybe a sequel or maybe a different topic entirely?
In some ways, we did. We've been maintaining a blog all this time, and we post probably on average once a month with whatever new ideas or observations we have. And just at the start of the pandemic, as sort of our COVID exercise, we went through all of the blog posts and we winnowed it down to the very best, organized them by topic, and we published on Amazon something that we call Rebels at Work Dispatches. And if you want to sort of get the best of what we've learned since the book through 2020, you can go there. I think sometimes about doing, doing another book, but I think I would try to, if I ever do another book, it will be about the other topic that I'm really passionate about, which is how to be a good thinker. And there's been actually, I follow these fairly closely, a lot of books recently on, being a better critical thinker and topics like that. So I'm not exactly sure what I have to add, but I think that would be the topic that would most intrigue me.
Yeah. Well, and on this topic of critical thinking, so you wrote an article in the Cipher Brief entitled "The Potential of Integrating Intelligence and Intuition." And that one intrigued me because you're really talking about basically two systems of thought. So what inspired you to write that?
Well, I'm going to tell you the true story, not a PR story. My colleague, Julia Mossbridge, and I presented at South by Southwest earlier this year on precognition and whether or not precognition could be part of intelligence. And precognition is exactly what it sounds like. Precognition is the study of whether or not somehow the future can leak into the present in such a way that human beings can get a sense of the future. If you think about it, precognition is something that has been with humans from time immemorial. Every tradition, every society has something about people who can think about the future, Delphi Oracle, whatever it might be. Anyway, we presented on South by Southwest, and the publisher of the Cipher Brief said, "Carmen, I'd love you to do an article for me on precognition." And so I thought about it, mulled it over for a couple of months, and felt that there was no way, or that it would be too hard, exceed my abilities to persuasively talk about precognition in a kind of direct way. And so I crafted the article so that I first talk about what is good thinking, then I talk about the importance of intuition in good thinking, and how it's been undervalued in recent years. And then at the end, I talk about any effort to harvest our intuition in a better way will eventually result in precognitive moments where you seemingly get an insight about the future. And what's funny, Tim, about that is my ultimate goal was to open up the conversation about precognition. But I found that most of my readers, almost all of them, just got hung up on the topic of intuition. That was already a bridge too far for them. And I was like, whoa, that is really interesting.
Yeah, well, and I want to come back to precognition because I think that's truly important, and it is a big idea. But I would be one of those readers that got hung up on intuition, because I think what you wrote in that article was truly profound about that as well. That's probably why people get stuck. I think they read that and they're like, wow, this is very important. So in the article, you were talking about two systems of human intelligence, right? And this is kind of a rough breakdown. So system one, hopefully I didn't get these switched around. System one was intuition, and then system two is logical and rational thought, right? And if I understood the article correctly, really what you're saying is that knowledge workers really tend to rely too heavily on this system two, which is logic, things that they can quantify, I guess, and then they just discount intuition. Was that kind of what you were saying?
Yeah, that's about right. And this idea of there being two systems is not my idea. I don't actually think it's Daniel Kahneman, the Nobel Prize winning economist idea either, although he popularized it about 10 years ago in what I thought at the time, and still think now, was a very good book called Thinking Fast and Slow. And thinking fast is our intuition, system one, and thinking slow is when we have to work, bring all our rational, logical, problem-solving skills to bear when we're thinking through a problem. And his point is that, most humans are lazy, And they like to do things with the kind of automatic, intuitive system one apparatus, and that gets us into a lot of trouble, because system one is where your knee-jerk biases live and where your emotions live, and et cetera, et cetera. And it's important for us to engage system two as much as we can. When I read the book 10 years ago, I thought it was extremely persuasive. One of the best books I had read about thinking. But over the years, I've come to understand that, you know, he swung the pendulum too far. That system one is actually the most powerful part of our brain. It's what our brain, if you think about it, for hundreds of thousands of years has evolved to do really well. It's our image processing capability. It's how our brain makes sense of what it sees and what we hear, and what we feel, and what we touch. And all of that, as we know from attempts to replicate that with artificial intelligence, is way more sophisticated than anything that we can do with machine learning. It does have problems. It does have biases. But what we tend to overlook is system two has biases as well. And the dominant bias, I think, of system two, and I'm not a neurologist or a cognitive scientist, but the dominant bias is that we are biasing ourselves to consider only those things for which we have material evidence. And what we've learned, for example, by understanding how complex society is and the phenomena of emergent behavior in the world, is that the things that really come to bite us, that are surprises, either in national security or for businesses, are things that emerge, coalesce really quickly. And so they don't have a lot of evidence that precedes them. It's not like you can count on system two to go, oh, look, here comes the internet. No, you can't do it that way. So what we really have to do, I think, to be better analysts, no matter what field we're in, is that we have to use system one and system two in an appropriate partnership and not have this, I think, kind of simplistic view that one is always better than the other.
Yeah, no, that makes complete sense. Well, do you think that discounting our intuition, is this something that comes out of the classical Enlightenment era and their reliance on pedestalizing rational thought above all else?
Yeah, I mean, you know, the Enlightenment was such a huge, the Reformation and then the Enlightenment, were such huge moments in world history. I had a professor once at college who said that one of the, and this will seem like a tangent, but it's quick, that one of the real interesting characteristics of Russia as a society is that it never had a Reformation, nor really an Enlightenment. And that he thought explained a lot of the uniqueness of Russian philosophical thought. That idea has always stuck with me. And, you know, the Enlightenment led us, and the scientific revolution and the industrial revolution that followed almost immediately, led us to prioritize mathematical thinking and the scientific method. And don't get me wrong, those are great, and we have accomplished a lot because of that. But what we'll tend to overlook with that are things like emotions and social moods and contagion, and, you know, epidemic theory applied to ideas. And when these things come into play, my experience is that they tend to overwhelm Enlightenment type thinking, that the enlightened thinkers, what they have in their toolkit to deal with this kind of emotional tempest is inadequate. You know, it's like talking about the truth problem in American or really world society right now. And we've come to learn that you cannot argue with a person that has an emotional attachment to a different idea, that almost always fails.
Yeah, yeah. Well, so in intelligence circles, has it been a challenge to get people to trust their intuition? And the reason, I guess the reason I ask, not only because of your background, but because when you're talking about the government, there's this, I would say there's a little bit more rigor and a little bit more rigidity to the culture, right? As you've mentioned, people, there's a lot more onboarding that goes on. There's also a lot more process and codification of those processes. So, because of that structure, is it something, has intuition been trained out of professionals in these agencies?
I would say that to some extent, it was. I think that the pendulum is swinging back toward a more complete thinking method. For example, the CIA presented at the famous Ideas Conference in Austin, Texas, South by Southwest, I think 3 years ago, just before the pandemic, on how they try to embed creativity in intelligence analysis. And creativity, let me tell you, does not come out of system 2. Creativity definitely comes out of our fascinating, fluid, intuitive mental abilities. And, I start that article in the Cipher Brief by telling a true story. The identities were disguised, about an analyst whom I observed when I was at the CIA, who would literally cut and paste analysis. And I'm thinking at the time, that can't be how analysis is done. But what this person was responding to was this view that was very common, that, all of our analysis has to be sourced to some kind of secret. And the problem with that is that it assumes that our ability to gather information, and all the information that we gather, accurately reflects reality. And I have to say, it wasn't until quite late in my career that I had this sort of epiphany, when I realized, oh my God, we have no way of knowing how much the information we have at hand, how well it accurately represents reality. And we have no way of measuring the gap between our information and reality. So I would often ask groups of analysts, imagine this entire room that I'm sitting in is everything that could be known about Al-Qaeda. Like, if you were the omniscient being, you would know everything. What part of this room represents what we actually do know? And that was a question that they probably had never thought about before. And then when they did think about it, they often would say, well, like this cup represents what we know. So the rest of it is unknown to us. And I think that once you realize that, then you can more easily accept the idea that we have to at least explore other ways of thinking that can give us some idea of what's in the rest of that information space.
Yeah, and that makes complete sense. So, the example that came to my mind, of intuition versus logic. And again, this would be one of the reasons that logic would be more reinforced in the organization, is the weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, right? Back in the day. And so you have major political decisions, that are made based on intelligence information. And, and then it blows back to the president, which blows back to the intelligence community. And it's like, well, what did you know? Why did you guys make this decision? So from an intelligence perspective, if it's based on logic, you can always fall back and say, well, look, we had X, Y, and Z, and this is why we made this decision. But does that push against intuition?
No, I think that's a really good point. And the fact that you can unpack your logic-based or evidentiary-based analysis is very powerful. And the fact that it is much harder to do that kind of forensic work with intuition is problematic. But I would think that we can develop techniques for documenting our intuition in better ways. So I think I advocate in the piece that you form sort of intuition workshops where you record your intuitive ideas. And once you record them, then you can apply your system to thinking to analyze them. And you could, develop, Jane over here seems to do really well on certain kinds of problem sets. So let's use her for those. And we seem to be doing really horrible on this other problem set. So let's not rely on these ideas too often. And I think you could apply an analytic overlay on your intuitive thinking and make it more useful. In fact, what I would say is that if you don't apply an analytic overlay on top of your intuitive thinking, then you're doing it wrong. Then, in fact, you're open to a lot of criticism. The whole replication issue emerges. Of course, replication issue is one that also hounds system two thinking as well, right? So, but you have to do it in a more rigorous way. And my unhappiness is that we haven't made enough of an effort to apply intuition in a more rigorous way. We haven't been serious about it. We've just ignored it, chosen to ignore it.
Yeah. Well, so in addition to traditional intuition, I want to come back to precognitive abilities, and because I think that this is a really big idea, this notion of being able to receive information from the future. So this is something that the CIA itself studied, right? This was the men who stare at goats, if I remember right.
Exactly. Yep.
Okay. Well, so if I understand this correctly, you kind of came back to this data, and you'd written in the article that Ray Hyman and Jessica Utz combed through several years of data, and they actually found this old remote viewing program doing precognitive results that were statistically significant. So, offhand, do you know how effective it was? I mean, and what's interesting about that is, I think remote viewing is something that a lot of people, they're familiar with, right? Like, late night coast to coast AM radio and stuff like that. But to be able to come back to that and look at that data from within the agency later on, I thought might give a unique perspective on it.
I'm not, familiar with, how well the program did, other than what, is available in the public domain. And all of this is available in the public domain. The history of the program, I think that during the Cold War, the US, the West was willing to try anything to try to get some insight about closed systems such as the Soviet Union. And I think we were aware of Soviet experiments with things like remote viewing. So if they were doing it, we were going to do it too. And the program sort of got moved around between different agencies. The CIA ended up being the last one to host it in the early 1990s, I think in a very responsible way, asked these outsiders to do an independent study of it. The study determined that, as you said, the remote viewing work had statistically significant results, i.e. better than chance. But the CIA concluded that it was just too difficult to figure out how to incorporate this into the work of the CIA. And thus, as far as I know, or anybody else knows, it ended. I will tell you that you can Google some things about the remote viewing experiments. So for example, if you Google President Carter and remote viewing, there's statements that he made about how supposedly the CIA used a psychic to get some, probably a remote viewer, to get some insight about a plane crash that had occurred somewhere, I think, in sub-Saharan Africa. So there is that out there, where at least, one instance, the idea that remote viewing was helpful was claimed by a president of the United States. But a president who, historically seems to have been more interested in unusual phenomena, perhaps, than other presidents. But since then, I only know what's available in the public domain, and I don't know of any effort to do this kind of work. And I personally think that in the 30 years since the CIA did that work and did that study, there's been a lot of advances in how we understand physics and quantum mechanics, and how spooky particles communicate at a distance, and the fact that time is, well, we don't really know what time is, and we don't really know what consciousness is. Those are both vibrant points of debate in the physics community, that I think there's, like a space in system two thinking. There's a space in scientific rational thinking that could accommodate the idea of precognition. And I just, working with Dr. Mossbridge, I've, become persuaded that it would be interesting to pursue, to see if we could, learn more, become better at it, if we, again, took a rigorous approach to it.
It's interesting. On a personal note, I mean, myself, my family, I think all of us, everyone I know, has had those moments where you can say, this is more than just intuition, right? And there are a variety of those. And from what I understand, some folks have more than others, but most people have at least a few throughout their lifetime,
right.
And the takeaway for me, I mean, I had many moments like that when I was younger, but I was never able to really contextualize it or understand it. And so it just became something that happened, and and then it's done. There's no way to really use that. Do you think that's something that we could use potentially in terms of intelligence gathering, collection, decision making, anything along those lines?
I do think so. I think that one thing that we could do is get a sense of either how to develop that talent or ability, whatever you want to call it, better in individuals. Develop ways to screen populations to decide, to figure out who's more talented, who seems to have a natural ability in this area than others. I personally don't think I'm particularly precognitive in any way. I think I'm kind of a dullard. But I think there are others that are way more competent. And I think the future is so hard to imagine, anticipate, paint, describe, and all of us do such a bad job at it. The intelligence community, businesses, individuals, that's really hard. That I just don't see what the harm is, and there is potential benefit in exploring whether or not our system one intuitive brains can kind of tunnel somehow into the future in a way that's compelling and useful.
Wonderful. Carmen, on that note, let me thank you for your time today, your career of service to our country, and your dedication to being a change maker from within. So let me close by asking, what comes next for you? What's coming up? Where will we see you in the headlines next?
Oh, well, I hope you don't see me in the headlines. I have never any interest in being in the headlines. People who really have had a CIA career don't really talk about it very much. And in fact, I think I'm one of the people that's out there that is at the far end of talking about it. Unless the people who talk about it a lot probably haven't had a real CIA career. So the headlines know, Julia and I think it's just been announced, are going to do a 6-week or 6-session seminar on intuition and precognition for a company called Emergent Risk International. And if you follow me on LinkedIn, I will be sharing the sign up information for that. So that's something that's quite immediate. It'll start, I think, October 4th.
Wonderful. And I will put all of your info up in the interview notes as well.
Right.
So, Carmen, thank you again, ma'am.
Thank you, Tim.